Welcome, everybody, to this second of the past president's addresses at this conference. It's great to have two from such fantastic speakers. So before I introduce Rachel, I'd like to say welcome to everybody. I hope you've been enjoying the conference. And it's also my pleasure not only to be chairing this session, but also to announce prizes for the EJ prizes for the last 2 years. So the 2020 winner that I'd like to announce is Long Live Keiju, the persistent effects of China's civil examination system by Ting Cheng, James Kai-Shin Chung, and Ching Cheng Ma. And it's a great paper. I've read it. It's fantastic. So please do go and read it. And then I'd also like to introduce the 2019 winner of the EJ Prize for Unreal Wages, Real Income and Economic Growth in England, 1260 to 1850, by Jane Humphreys and Jacob Weisdorf. Unfortunately, we won't be able to welcome the prize winners to the platform, but you can see videos of both of those on the EJ conference stand at the conference platform. So please do go and look at those. But now let me turn to the speaker. So it's my pleasure, real pleasure, to introduce Rachel Griffith, who is going to give the past president's talk on obesity, poverty, and public policy. Rachel's list of accolades and positions is just so impressive. She's research director at IFS. She's professor of economics at the University of Manchester. She set up the Economics Observatory, which has been a fantastic resource during the COVID crisis. And she's also editor of Microeconomics Insights. She is a fellow of the British Academy. She's a fellow of the Econometric Society and an honorary foreign member of the American Economic Association. She's currently associate editor of Econometrica and sits on the council of the ESRC. She has won numerous prizes and awards. In 2014, she was awarded 2015, she was awarded a CBE for her services to economic policy. And she was made a dame in this year's New Year's Honours for her services to economic policy and education. She's also been the first female president of the EEA, and she is obviously the past president of the Royal Economic Society and was only the second woman to be that and the first in 35 years. Her CV is incredibly impressive. She's been managing editor of the EJ. She's made huge contributions to economics, and her interests are basically in the functioning of government, in the functioning of markets, and her specific interests relate to the behavior of consumers and firms and the impact of government policy in food markets. She's also published widely on innovation. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce this talk by Rachel. Rachel will give her talk by video, and then we'll move to Q&A after 45 minutes. So welcome, Rachel, and I so look forward to this talk.
Obesity rates in the UK are high and rising. Rising obesity and its association with malnutrition and poverty is one of the big societal challenges that we face today. In this talk, I will first lay out the problem, which is the high rates of obesity and malnutrition and its association with poverty. Obesity and malnutrition are likely important constraints on the opportunities of children, particularly those growing up in deprivation. I'll then consider what might be some of the potential causes and what evidence there is to help us identify where policy might be able to improve welfare. I'll discuss some of the potential policy solutions. This is a very active area of policy innovation, and it's important that we understand how well different policies address the problem And what are some of the potential unintended consequences of different policies? And I'll end by saying that there's much that public policy can do in terms of changing market signals, such as relative prices, and policies that change the choice environment to allow people to make choices that better align with their own long-term interests. However, it's also important that we look to policies that directly lift children out of poverty. Let me start by setting out the problem. Obesity has risen dramatically in the UK and many other countries, with nearly 1 in 3 adults in England being obese and around 1 in 25 being morbidly obese. So just to provide some context for what that means, obesity is the ratio of weight to height. So I'm 5 foot 5 inches tall. If I weighed 82 kilos, I'd be obese. If I weighed 95 kilos, I'd be morbidly obese. So why should you care if I weigh 95 kilos? Well, one reason is that it leads to classic externalities in the form of increased healthcare costs. For example, if we look at the hospital episodes data for the UK, where obesity is the primary or secondary diagnosis, we see that this has risen almost fourfold over the past decade, and it costs considerably more to treat an obese person in hospital than a normal weight person. Over the recent SARS-CoV-2 epidemic, we've seen that people who are obese suffer more in terms of complications and ultimately death. These externalities suggest that policies that reduce obesity could improve social welfare. Obesity in children is also high. For example, something like 1 in 5 of all 10 to 11-year-olds in England are obese. Children are becoming obese at younger ages and are staying obese into adulthood. Most worrying, perhaps, is the fact that obesity is more prevalent in more deprived areas, with children living in the most deprived regions of the UK being nearly twice as likely to be obese as those living in the least deprived. And if we focus on those that are severely obese, in the most deprived regions, there are over 4 times as many severely obese children as in the least deprived regions. This gap in obesity between children growing up in the least and most deprived areas is widening. These statistics raise concern that obesity and associated malnutrition are potentially important drivers for long-term inequalities. Public Health England highlights being obese as leading to long-term harms, for example, due to school absence and behavioural problems at school. This means that these potentially have important consequences for children's long-term health as well as social and economic outcomes. Ensuring that all children, including those come from disadvantaged backgrounds, are well nourished seems to be a cornerstone of providing equality of opportunity. It's important for both physical and mental growth. A poorly nourished child will struggle to concentrate in school, leading to health and social and economic adverse effects. Economists have formalized these ideas recently with the label internalities, which are like externalities but where the social costs of excess consumption fall on the person themselves in the future. For children, the long-term consequence of eating an unhealthy diet are likely not to be factored into their decision-making, and for some children, their parents do not seem to be fully accounting for these either. This is particularly true for children growing up in deprivation. So, is it only calories that matter? Well, first of all, it's calories net of energy expended on activity, and activity level is very important. I'll return to that in a minute, though I'll say relatively little about it. But for obesity, to a first order, it is mainly about calories. There's some limited evidence that eating some types of foods, such as foods that are high in sugar, also lead to greater weight gain. But primarily, it's about how much you eat relative to how much energy you expend. However, excess consumption of some types of food are also associated with some particular types of risk factors, probably causally so, though there's limited evidence in some areas. So for example, high consumption of foods that have a lot of free sugars, so that is sugars that don't occur naturally but that are added, can cause insulin resistance, which can cause diabetes. High consumption of salt can harden your arteries, leading to high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. There are more direct links. For example, high consumption of sugar leads to dental disease, which has been growing quite rapidly amongst children in the UK. So excess sugar has been a particular target of policies around the world, in part because of its association with these other diseases, and in part because of its association with obesity. So to see why, let's consider this figure. Along the horizontal axis, we have age, going from 1 year old to 70 years old. Along the vertical axis, we have grams of added sugar per day. Added sugar does not include naturally occurring sugars. So for example, it doesn't include sugars that are in natural fruit or occur in milk, for example. So the red line shows the UK government's recommended daily maximum consumption of sugar based on medical advice. That's expressed in grams. So for adults, the maximum recommended is 30 grams a day. This black line shows the median daily consumption reported in the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, a survey run by the UK government where respondents are asked to record consumption of all foods over 2 days. There's considerable evidence that intake surveys are underreported. So this is likely to be an underestimate of true levels of consumption. It's clear from this picture that we consume way above recommended maximums at all ages, but particularly at younger ages, where very young children are consuming orders of magnitude more than even the maximum recommended for adults. If we look at the 90th and 10th percentiles of the consumption distribution, we see that almost all young children in the UK are consuming more than the medically recommended amount of added sugar. So over the pandemic, food insecurity has risen. Food insecurity was already high in the UK, amongst the highest rates in Europe. Food insecurity is a measure of when a household does not have regular access to nutritious food, and it can be driven by economic factors or by other factors, for example, supply. Food bank use has also increased considerably, in particular by families with children. It's likely that this situation has led to worsening diet quality for children in poorer households. There's widespread public support for Marcus Rashford's campaign when he called for free school meals to be extended to families during lockdown when children weren't in school. And this campaign led to a reversal of government policy. Data from Understanding Society's COVID-19 survey, one of the big UK social science surveys, suggests that this policy had some but limited success. Half of all the children that were eligible for free school meals could not access the scheme in April 2020, and children who attended school during that time were almost 6 times more likely to get a free school meal than children who did not. So families of children who had free school meals were also more likely to use food banks than families who could not. So as I mentioned earlier, it's not only what we eat, but it's also how active we are that leads to obesity. So over the past few decades, work and daily life have become less strenuous and more sedentary, and that's also probably been a cause of rising obesity. Over the pandemic, it looks like activity levels have declined. We don't have great quality data on this yet, but initial indications suggest that children in particular have been much less active over the pandemic. So to summarize, there's been a significant rise in obesity and associated diet-related disease. Child obesity is high and increases with deprivation. The consequences of obesity are potentially large in the form of externalities and internalities, particularly for children growing up in deprivation. Obesity, malnutrition, and poverty go hand in hand, and we've seen a rise over the epidemic. So why are people making bad food choices? We want policies that help people make better choices, i.e. that reduce externalities and internalities from poor food choice decisions. In order to design good policy, we need to understand why people are making bad choices, and that's what I want to talk about now. I'll then go on to talk about how specific policies or combinations of policies affect different people. Do they affect those with the highest externalities or internalities? Are they the ones that respond? And what other effects these policies might have. For example, are there unintended consequences? Does it change firm strategic behaviour and lead to different equilibrium outcomes than anticipated? But before doing that, let's look at food prices. Food prices have fallen in OECD countries over the past 4 decades. This means that food budget shares have fallen, and this has led to considerable welfare gains for poorer households for whom the budget share of foods is significant and is much higher than richer households. Food prices in the UK have fallen faster than on average in the OECD countries over the 1980s and 90s. But they rose dramatically in the 2000s due largely to the depreciation of sterling, and of course are rising again now due to Brexit. I show this picture to provide context that policies that substantially increase food prices may have adverse welfare consequences, particularly for poorer households, and this is something we should keep in mind when designing policy. Something that you might find surprising is that the price of ingredients have declined by most. Why do I make the distinction here between ingredients and processed foods? Because that's something that the World Health Organization has emphasized, as do many other nutritional advisors, that home-cooked food is on the whole healthier than processed food. That's partly because people don't know what's in processed food, so may inadvertently consume nutrients that they're not fully aware of, but also because on average processed foods less healthier, includes more salt, more sugar, more things that aren't good for us. So this picture shows us that the market price of ingredients has fallen by most. The market price of processed foods has fallen but not by as much, and the market price of food out, so in restaurants, fast food, confectionery, snacks, has actually increased. If we look at the share of the food budget that goes on ingredients versus processed food and food out, we see that there's been a fall in the consumption of ingredients, quite a considerable fall from something like 55% to something like 35%. We see this not only in the expenditure shares, but in quantity shares as well. So this may be somewhat surprising given the change in relative prices, and one reason for this might be changes in time use. Buying ingredients and preparing food at home requires not just the purchase of the ingredients, but also the time spent in preparation. And if we look at time use surveys, what we see is that the amount of time spent on food management, which is on shopping and cooking, has fallen considerably, particularly by women, spending less time in these activities. And while the amount of time that men spent has increased, it's not been by enough to compensate for the decline in women. Women are spending more time in the labour market, labour force participation has increased, hours of work conditional on participation have increased, and the wage offers for women have increased. So if we put these changes together with the price of ingredients, we see and then consider the cost of a home-cooked meal as opposed to just the market price of the ingredients. So we combine ingredients and time, where the cost of time has increased due to outside opportunities. We see that the cost of home-cooked food has actually increased if we compare the solid green line to the dotted green line. So to summarize, the long-term decline in food prices has had important welfare benefits for low-income households. The market price of ingredients, which are generally thought to be healthier, has fallen by more than processed foods and food out, but because of changes in time use, and perhaps other factors, the price of home-cooked healthier foods has increased when we think about the opportunity cost of time. And that's going to be important when we think about designing policies, particularly those that seek to change the relative price of healthier versus less healthy foods. So many policies that governments have implemented around the world have aimed to provide information and education on what is healthy food and how to prepare healthy foods. And these have had some, but limited impact. So in the UK, these policies have included the Eat 5 a Day campaign, encouraging people to eat more fruit and vegetables, warning to be wary of hidden salt in processed foods, changes to regulations over food label packaging, and guides for meals for how to cook healthy foods. So why has it been that these have had limited impact? Well, one possible reason is that people do not fully account for this information when they take decisions over food. There's considerable evidence that people lack self-control when taking decisions over what they eat. This is a picture from a paper that I wrote with several Belgians and Martin O'Connell and Kate Smith, where we looked at variation in people's diets over time. And one of the interesting findings is that people's diet varies considerably over time. In fact, the variation within an individual over time is at least as big as the variation across individuals. And that has interesting implications for policy if we want to think about not trying to make me consume like you, but get me to be the best that I ever am. And so there's some different implications in what we would think there. So this picture shows Google searches for the word diet across the year. And we see that in January each year, there's a spike in people's resolution to have a healthy diet, and that declines over the year. So when we look in more detailed data, we see that this pattern is mirrored in actually the health characteristics of foods that people buy, with people buying much healthier foods towards the start of the year and that quality declining over the year. But also that within individual, there's a lot of variation associated with a lot of other events where people perhaps reset their resolution around Valentine's Day, around momentous birthdays, around all sorts of other events. And so this lack of self-control may be one of the reasons why we see that providing information to people doesn't have such big impact. So work by psychologists and economists such as Sendhil Mullainathan and others have looked at the impact of poverty on cognition and on people's ability to use and act on information they're given. So the poor often behave in less capable ways, which can further perpetuate poverty. And that's certainly something we see when we look at food choices. I've talked so far about food choices in general, but shown you that children living in deprivation eat worse, are more likely to be obese. And when we look at the quality of foods that are in the household, we see that those are worse too. So what Sendhil Mullainathan and people argue in this work is that poverty directly impedes people's cognitive function, because poverty-related concerns consume mental resources, leaving less capacity for other tasks. So being poor means coping not only with a shortfall of money, but also with a whole bunch of other cognitive challenges to decisions we need to make, things we need to deal with. So the poor, in this view, are less capable not because of some inherent trait that they have, but because the very context of being poor itself imposes cognitive load and limits people's cognitive capacity. So in other words, the finding is that it's not about poor people, but it's about people who find themselves being poor. And this has very important implications for how we think about the impact of information campaigns or other policies where we're trying to encourage people to make better choices. So another area that researchers have focused on has been the impact of advertising and the interplay between advertising, cognition, self-control, and the impact that has on choices. So experimental evidence shows that children in particular, when they're exposed to food adverts, but eat more and are more likely to become obese. In work that we have done estimating the exposure of advertising, we first show that if we look at TV ads, for example, in 2015, we see that unhealthy foods are much more advertised than healthy foods. We also show that households in the lowest income quartile are something like 20% more likely to see adverts for healthy foods than households in higher income quartile. This is because they're more likely to watch TV, and also because of the time and the types of shows that they watch are shows in which are times in which adverts are more, for unhealthy foods are more likely to be shown. So in summary, food prices have declined, leading to large welfare gains for low-income households. Changes in time use have made home preparation more costly. Government policy is focused on information campaigns, but these are unlikely to be well targeted at households in poverty due to concerns about cognitive overload and other concerns about temptation and self-control. And advertising is likely to amplify these problems of cognitive overload and temptation. This is a very active area of policy, with governments introducing taxes and subsidies to various types of foods, regulations to labeling, restrictions to the availability, restrictions to advertising, and a host of government information campaigns. So we want policy that helps people make better choices, that reduces externalities and internalities. And we've talked a little bit about some of the reasons why people may be making bad food choices. So now I want to talk about how specific policies, or combinations of policies, affect different people. Do those with the highest externalities or internalities respond? And what might be some of the unintended consequences, particularly in terms of firm strategic behaviors? So soda taxes have been implemented in over 50 jurisdictions, being one of the most popular policies to be implemented to date. One of the reasons that soda taxes have been so popular is because the statistics we talked about earlier of the very high excess levels of sugar consumption. Soda's also been a target because soda has very few redeeming nutritional characteristics. If we think about policies like tobacco taxes or drink drive campaigns, the government has a very simple message there. Don't drink drive. Don't smoke. With food, the message is a little bit more complicated. Don't eat isn't the right message, and governments have been a little bit concerned about going too far in that direction because of the adverse consequences that may have in leading to people under-consuming. And so targeting something like soda has been seen to be acceptable because it has high in sugar and has no beneficial effects. So in a review that we've done of 27 studies that looked at across a large number of different jurisdictions, we see that taxes almost always lead to an increase in prices and have led in most cases to substantial reductions in the purchases of soda. But in order to understand whether these policies have been effective, we need to know whether they've led to reductions in consumption in those individuals who generate the largest internalities. So who is that target population? Unfortunately, we don't have very good estimates of internalities. For whom is the consequences of excess consumption when they're young the largest? And what of those consequences are being taken account of at the time the consumption decision is taken? Those are very difficult things to know the answer to. There are some estimates, but we don't have widespread estimates. So policymakers have focused on the young, the poor, and heavy sugar consumers. And so we'll focus on them in our work. Are these groups responsive to taxes? If they are, then they gain in the form of reduced long-run internalities, which compensates for the loss through higher prices. If no, then they do not benefit from reduced internalities, and they pay the higher prices. So if we think about the impact on poor households, we've not made them better off in the form of reducing internalities, and we've made them poorer because they're now paying higher prices. And so that may be a concern, and we'd like to learn about whether we could design better policies that are more effectively targeted. So in work that I've done with Pierre Dubois and Martin O'Connell, we ask this question and related questions. And in that work, we tackle a number of methodological challenges. So in particular, it's important that we can allow for a lot of heterogeneity in preferences and responsiveness across people to policies like taxes. That's key to the question we're trying to ask. How do different people respond? So it's important that we allow that preference heterogeneity and that we're able to capture it well in data. In addition, we want to be able to relate that heterogeneity to demographics of interest, such as those that might lead to high externalities, like being young, poor, and being a heavy sugar consumer. And we might be interested in doing that in ways that don't impose much parametric restrictions. And that's been the focus of work we did, for example, in our AER paper, how well targeted our soda tax is. So one of the graphs that come from that paper is shown here. Along the horizontal axes, we have age and mean sugar consumption in individuals' total diet, accounting for everything that they buy in the supermarket and eat. So people who are high sugar consumers we think of the ones who will experience the highest internalities and cause the greatest externalities. Those who are the youngest have been the focus of policy because we may think the internalities are highest for that group. In the paper, we also consider household income. Along the vertical axis, we see the reduction in grams of sugar as a result of a price increase that's of the scale of the soda taxes that we've seen implemented. So what we see in this picture, first of all, is that all the bars are positive. So everyone responds to some extent to the change in price brought about from the soda tax. And actually the size of these changes is fairly substantial given the modest change in price. If we look in the sugar consumption dimension, we see that the largest responses are amongst those who have low sugar consumption. So that's bad news. We'd like policy to lead to the biggest responses for those who have high sugar consumption, but it's the people who have low sugar consumption that respond. That's perhaps not surprising when we look at what's driving that. It's that the high sugar consumers have very strong preferences for sugar, so it takes a lot to shift them away. If we look in the age distribution, however, we see better news in that we see that it's the youngest consumers that respond by the most. They're more price sensitive. That's even conditional on income. And so that's good news because we think that they are probably the highest sugar consumer, the consumers for whom the internalities are highest. So if we look in a little more detail at the UK implementation of the soft drinks soda tax, we see that the tax schedule that was introduced in the UK in 2018 looked like this. So a drink that had at least between 5 and 8 grams of sugar per 100 millilitres is taxed at 18p per litre, and drinks that have over 8 grams of sugar per 100 millilitres are taxed at 24p per litre. So that leads to this funny, kinky type demand schedule depending on the sugar intensity of the product. So we want to look at how firms responded to the implementation of that policy. So that policy was implemented in 2018. So I'm just going to show you what happened to the distribution of products available in the market before and after the implementation of that policy. So here we go back to 2010. The black bars show you the number of products available in the UK market at that sugar intensity. And we see that the mass point is around 10 grams per 100 grams. So that's around what Coke and Pepsi are. And if we go 2011, 2012, the years before the implementation of the sugar tax, we see that there's not much variation around that 10 gram mark. And then as we approach the implementation of the sugar tax implemented in 2018, we see a jump to a large number of products being reformulated down to below the tax threshold of 5 grams per litre. So if we compare before and after, we see that around 50% of manufacturers reduced the sugar content of drinks, and that led to considerable reductions in the amount of sugars that people got from soda. So both consumers respond in terms of reducing the amount of sodas that they purchased, but also firms respond in reformulating the soft drinks such that they were less sugar intensive. And both of these things together meant that the tax was had fairly substantial impact on sugar consumption through drinks. So another policy that's been popular and talked about a lot has been restrictions to banning of junk food adverts. And in a paper with Pierre Dubois and Martin O'Connell, we study the impact that banning adverts for junk food will have both on consumers and on the strategic behaviour of firms. We show that adverts affect the choices that consumers make, and that banning them will lead them to consume less, but will also affect the behaviour of firms. So importantly, in order to understand the welfare implications of these changes, we need to take a stance on whether advertising is informative or distortionary. And we don't have a great identification strategy, in fact few exist in the literature, to really tell whether that's true. However, if we look at adverts in the crisps market, which is what we study, we can, I think, argue that it's pretty unlikely that seeing a supermodel eat crisps is informative about the true impact that eating crisps will have on your health or utility. So in the paper, we calculate welfare under both assumptions, informative or persuasive, but we think that it's the assumption that they're persuasive is pretty likely to be true. So adverts for junk food are persuasive. They distract people from some of the negative characteristics of products like price and bad health consequences. And they lead people to choose to buy more junk foods than in the absence of an advert. So if we ban adverts, people pay more attention to these characteristics. So they buy healthier, they're more responsive to price, they buy healthier varieties, and they buy less. They substitute to the outside option more often. So what's the impact of banning junk food adverts? Well, it also affects firms' strategic responses. So firms compete in advertising and in prices. So banning advertising means, first of all, that consumers may pay more attention to price and to other characteristics. And so that makes price competition more important. But also, firms can no longer compete in advertising, so they compete more in prices. So both of these effects mean that price competition increases, leading prices to fall. So while banning persuasive advertising reduces purchases of junk foods because people are now paying more attention to the health consequences and to price, it also leads to reductions in prices in equilibrium, which partly mitigates the impact. And so this is just an illustration of why it's important to think through all of the consequences of policies like this. So in fact, the UK does have restrictions to junk food advertising. In 2017, it restricted the advertising of junk foods on TV during children's TV programming. So one thing that firms did in response to this was adapt their advertising strategies. For example, McDonald's introduced this advert, which was for carrots, which was allowed because carrots are not a junk food, but clearly had a Happy Meal in the background. Firms also shifted their advertising to avoid the restrictions. The restrictions were specifically during children's TV programming, which was interpreted as TV programs in which a certain percentage of the audience was children. And so advertisers shifted their advertising to non-children's programming, when of course many children are still watching. So despite the ban, most adverts that children see on TV are still for junk food. And because of this, government is currently legislating to extend the restrictions for adverts for junk foods to all programming, and also to restrict online advertising, which at the time was not important, but now, of course, is very important. So in ongoing work, we're trying to think about how these policies interact. So, for example, soda taxes increase the price of sugary drinks and reduce consumption through the price channel. But taxes may also change firms' other strategic choices, such as advertising. So in the way that we saw that advertising restrictions will change pricing decisions, taxes may also change advertising restrictions. So advertising itself can shape demand, as we saw in the earlier work, and that will lead to, that means it will affect price elasticities. Advertising also has long-term effects on demand, leading to dynamic considerations. And in ongoing work with Rossi, Abby Rafa, Pierre Dubois, and Martin O'Connell, we're considering the impact of soda taxes and advertising restrictions when we allow for dynamic firm responses. This work is particularly relevant as the government considers whether it should introduce broader taxes on sugar. So this is a currently live policy debate, and one of the questions is what products should be targeted and what would be the likely impact. So if we go back to the picture I showed you earlier and look at what are the high sugar products that account for most of the excess consumption, and if we focus on younger ages, as I've argued, the internalities are likely to be highest in people of younger ages, and I can zoom in on that portion in the red rectangle there, we see, first of all, that for teenagers, around half of sugar consumption is accounted for by sugar-sweetened drinks and half by food. That's been one of the motivating factors behind focusing on soft drinks taxes. For younger children, food makes up a larger component, and most of this is food in the home. And so let's look at what types of foods account for that portion. So we see that biscuits are the highest share, followed by confectionery, spreads like jams, and then other foods. And so one question is how likely a tax would be to lead to reformulation of these products to less sugary varieties, as we've seen with the soft drinks tax. Perhaps it's also important to think about subsidies to healthy foods, for example, fruits, which may be seen as substitutes for biscuits and confectionery. As we talked about earlier, the reductions in the overall price of food have had important welfare benefits for households in poverty. And so we may want to focus on changing relative prices while not increasing overall prices. The other thing to comment on is that in the UK, retailers play a very large role. There's a small number of dominant retailers, and they have very large market shares in terms of selling their own brand products. So both in terms of reformulation and advertising, retailers are also big players in the market. So to summarize, there's compelling evidence that people are making suboptimal choices regarding food consumption, particularly the bad consequences for children growing up in deprivation, both because the choices that are being made by them and their parents are poor, but also because the consequences are likely to be larger in the long run due to the lack of compensatory investments. Policy can potentially make people better off by protecting them from themselves and from outside temptation, but to be effective, policy has to be well targeted. And there's many reasons why individual and firm behaviours may undermine the ability of policy to achieve this aim. Policies can make things worse and might even reduce the welfare of the people they're aiming to help. So we need to be wary of those sorts of unintended consequences. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't implement policies. It just means that we need to do so intelligently with an evidence base that informs us on what the likely impacts will be. I want to return to talk about the links between obesity and poverty and how public policy can break these. Rising obesity is one of the big societal challenges we face today. Obesity and poverty are clearly linked, and assuring that all children are well nourished seems a cornerstone of the provision of equality of opportunity. A poorly nourished child will struggle to concentrate at school, and we know that differences in educational attainment are an important driver in the gap in adult earnings between children growing up in disadvantage versus affluent families. Good nutrition is essential to both physical and mental growth, and poor nutrition leads not only to longer-term health problems, but also poor economic and social outcomes. So child poverty in the UK has increased over the last decades after falling for several decades. And COVID, of course, has hit households and occupations that are more likely to be in poverty harder than wealthier households. If we look at who was in poverty in the UK by work status prior to the pandemic, we see that households that were workless were the most vulnerable to poverty, with around 60% of households that didn't have work being in poverty. And this doesn't in fact vary much across household types, with the poverty rate being around 60% for lone parents or couples with children. If we look at households that had work, we see that the likelihood of being in poverty is less at around 20%. Now, of course, if we think about the number of children that are in poverty, we need to think about the fact that most households do have work. So if we look at the share of households who are in work prior to the pandemic, this is reasonably low. So COVID has hit households and occupations that are most likely to be in poverty, and so it's likely that this will increase worklessness and increase poverty. And both of these are likely to lead to increases in child poverty and increases in child poverty in workless households. So, of course, the government has announced substantial temporary increases in benefits to help people through the pandemic, and those have been very important. However, if we look at what was happening to the state provision of benefits for out-of-work households before the pandemic, there have been very large cuts in these, and the generosity has reduced substantially over the last decade. So what this figure shows is the percentage change in real benefit entitlement for workless households between 2011 and 2020, before any temporary measures that were introduced by the government as a result of the pandemic. And we see that across the board, there were pretty substantial reductions in the generosity of these benefits. Across all households, it was around a 15% reduction, and across households with children, this varied slightly with households with more children experiencing bigger declines. So what was the impact of the temporary measures introduced as a result of the pandemic? Well, these did slightly increase the generosity, but there's still the generosity is still low relative to the generosity levels of a decade ago. So these cuts were partly due to the relatively high inflation rates experienced in that decade, combined with cash terms freezes in many benefits claimed by workless households. But they were also importantly to do with explicit reductions in the generosity that came along with the introduction of universal credit. So as I said, the temporary increases only partially unwind these, and they're temporary. So to have long-term impacts, it's likely that we'll need substantive and possibly costly policy reforms that lift children out of poverty. And these are important in combination with the policies that I discussed earlier that change relative prices and alter the choice environment. Reforms to universal credit are the most direct way to lift households out of income poverty. But free school meals and Healthy Start vouchers, while they provide a relatively small amount in income terms, are a very important part of the safety net in protecting children from impoverished families from hunger and poor nutrition. They're both targeted at the poorest households, and they directly are targeted at improving nutrition. So looking at how these policies could be extended and expanded to most effectively target the most vulnerable children will be important. So to finish where I started, obesity and malnutrition are likely important constraints to the opportunities of children, particularly those growing up in deprivation. There's much that public policy can do in terms of changing market signals, such as relative prices, and policies that change the choice environment to allow people to make better choices that are more aligned with their own long-term interests. However, it's also important to look at policies that directly lift children out of deprivation.
Thank you, Rachel, for an absolutely fabulous talk. I think it illustrated your commitment to seriously using economic tools to understand a major policy issue and concern of our age. And the fact that, you look at the fact that in these areas, government tend to take a number of measures. Those measures interact. Your work looks explicitly at how they interact and looks too at how firms respond as well as consumers, is just such a mark of fantastic economics and of your rigor and strength. So I think that's been wonderful, and we've got a whole pile of questions coming in. So I would love to ask some questions myself, but I'm going to turn over to the audience who have been waiting patiently. And kind of one of the first sort of areas that has attracted a lot of interest is the issue of soda taxes. And people have reflected that soda taxes have often been very unpopular because people have seen them as paternalistic interventions by the state on their free choices. What are your thoughts on the kind of welfare economics and ethical questions raised by soda taxes?
Great. Well, thanks very much, Carol. It's excruciating to have 45 minutes of watching yourself. So it's an interesting question of what we think about the paternalism of this whole range of policies. I have to admit that myself, when I started working in this area about 10 years ago, that was very much my view too. That what's the government doing telling me to eat, what to eat, or trying to influence the decisions I make? That's clearly a place where I have better information than the government. Why should they get involved? However, the more I look at it, the more I just think there's compelling evidence that people are making bad choices. And there's compelling evidence that very large firms are manipulating the choices that people take. And so that some regulation, perhaps in the form of changing relative prices, perhaps in the form of restricting activities of firms such as advertising, would be beneficial for social welfare. However, those policies can also go very wrong and reduce social welfare. And that's been a very important theme of my work, of trying to identify who the winners and who the losers are and how they affect people. And so I think it's very important that we keep those issues in mind.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, people might have made the same arguments about smoking 40 years ago and now no longer do. And indeed, 20 years ago, people didn't think obesity was a problem. Yes. Not because it wasn't rising, but because obviously it just wasn't seen as a problem in the way that we now know much more about the medical side of it, as well as the kind of economics. So I think
just to add one thing, I think with soda taxes in particular, very specifically to this question, if you take the work in our AER paper very literally, there are losers. The losers are older men. Older men do have to pay the tax. They lose in just standard compensating variation sort of sense, and they probably don't gain in terms of the internalities, whereas poor children gain. And so I think most people's social welfare function would weight those against each other in a favorable way, but we can have an intelligent discussion about that.
Interesting. And I think that relates to a second question that folk have asked, which is, should we be including the cost savings of reduced externalities and internalities as offsetting the cost of more generous welfare benefits?
Well, in theory we should, but in practice we have very little idea of what the size of these are. I mean, we all know that measuring externalities in the best case is very difficult, even when we're looking at like research and development investment or something. Here, I think we really have no idea what the actual numbers of these are. I think it's pretty clear they're very large, but one thing I didn't talk about in my lecture, which I should have done, is areas for potential research. And I think one thing, particularly for more health-oriented economists, is we know very little about the scale of these internalities and externalities and how they vary across different types of people. And so yes, we should offset those, but I think actually empirically to do that as a policymaker is super difficult. You're on mute.
I am, yes, a nice challenge for those who are interested in these things. So a kind of question that's related to this whole theme is, do you think that an increase in minimum wages and improvement in working conditions can help address these issues? And a kind of rider to that is that sometimes we kind of shift the responsibility onto individuals, including sort of referring to individuals' lack of self-control, when there are many factors that affect that self-control. I think the issues of thinking about what people in poverty actually experience mentally that you drew attention to is an example of that. So I think the question is, how much do you think increases in minimum wages or improvements in working conditions can help here?
So I think if your focus is on child poverty, minimum wages are a very poor policy for that. Minimum wages do very little to lift people out of poverty. There's a whole bunch of research by the IFS showing that. So as I said, it showed the people who the highest risk of being in poverty is among workless households. And so minimum wages don't benefit workless households and perhaps even make it harder for them to find work. And even amongst children living in households where there is work, minimum wages don't benefit the poorest ones. Policies that make work pay for children, for households which have children in poverty, are crucial and I think an essential part of policy. I think minimum wages are good for other reasons, but I don't think that's it's a well-targeted policy here. So I'd really refer to the work of my colleagues at IFS who've done much more on that than I have. But I definitely think that policies that lift children out of poverty are crucial, and policies that make work pay for low-educated and low-income people are essential.
Okay, and then I was interested to know what you think about programs like fruit and vegetable prescriptions and subsidies that are being tried in the US. Is this too little, too late?
I'm afraid I don't know the specific literature on those policies. So I have done some work on, I think that subsidizing healthy foods is an important part of a package of policies that governments should think about. And going back also to the second question, to the previous question, policies that help people execute self-control or commit. So things like removing chocolate bars from the till in supermarkets, so things that empower people to make better choices, to change the choice environment, I think are important. So in the UK, Healthy Start vouchers have been shown to be very effective at improving the diet quality of poor children. So thinking about how you can subsidize healthy foods, if we just subsidized fruit, that has huge dead weight because most of that is bought by wealthy people. So I think you need to be careful there about exactly how you do that. But I think definitely thinking about how we change the relative prices, and so use subsidies not only to change the relative prices, but also as nudges to shift towards a healthier diet. But honestly, I think we don't know enough about perhaps more the psychological side of it, the cognitive side of people's decision-making processes there. And so how economic tools can be combined with understanding of people's decision-making process to shift towards healthier diets is certainly an important area for policy to look at.
Yeah, so presumably when you were pointing out the decrease in food prices over the last 10 years, that did not lead to an increase in fruit consumption and a decrease in biscuit consumption amongst poor households, which you might expect it to do so.
No, that's right. Yeah. So relative, people's food choices are driven by more than relative prices and absolute prices. There's a lot more going on that non-separabilities with time use and cognition and the way that we process food is changed in a whole host of ways.
So I think there's a question that is about kind of trying to integrate policies. So the question is, how might we integrate the biological medical aspects of obesity with economic policies that we might want to introduce? For example, mental health disorders often cause obesity and can indeed be caused by obesity. So is there a danger with these policy approaches that largely affect individual incentives and ignore these kind of integrated aspects of policy when you just focus on one?
That's a great question, and it's super hard to answer. It's true in lots of areas. So absolutely, mental health, there's a strong correlation between mental health and food insecurity. And I think there's very interesting things to look into there. So it's a great question too, because it's a little bit part of what I've been trying to do recently. So I'm involved in the Obesity Policy Research Unit, which comes out of the Department of Health and Social Care. I also talk a lot to the Treasury and to people in DEFRA. And joined up policy is super hard. So the UK, it's hard to do, and it's hard to coordinate people to do. So the UK did appoint Henry Dimbleby to do the National Food Strategy, which is in process at the moment. And the idea, Henry, who started Lyon, so has a good track record in good food, is the idea of his report is to look across the piece, across all government policy towards farming, in health, in economics, and propose a set of policies. But, we're far from that place. But it's a great question, and it's definitely what we should be aspiring to do.
Okay. So there's a couple of people who are interested in saying, how confident are we that the link between poverty and obesity is causal? So it seems crucial to the idea of that reducing poverty will also cause a reduction in obesity, because it might be possible, if it's not true, that making poor people richer will just end up making them consume more of the kind of foods that you don't want them to consume.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We don't know health and what the relationship between health and wealth, not only in this area, is a difficult one. I think, I focused on the story of cognitive overload because I think that seems very plausible. Do we have really strong empirical evidence for it? No. We don't get to run randomized trials where we make people poor or we make them in bad health and follow their life. So I think we can look for plausibility there. There is a puzzle there too, that if you give people temporarily more money, there is some evidence that they buy worse quality. The diet decreases. That is true. So if you look in times of hardship, actually, like over the financial crash, people's diet got better. They stopped having treats. They stopped going out there. So there's a considerable amount of evidence that that's true. Does that mean in the long run they wouldn't? I think we don't know enough about those relationships. And again, that's a great area for research. It's a tricky one. But undoubtedly, those two things are intricately related. I'm not sure asking which caused which is really the right way to ask the question. I think understanding how policy interventions will affect outcomes is incredibly important. And so thinking of what we can do to particularly improve children's diets. It's pretty clear that if you take children in deprivation and provide them with healthy food, for example, in school, that improves the diet quality. Whatever the causes are there, the outcome is what we're trying to achieve.
In a sense, you're force feeding them in an environment they can't move out of at that point. This is kind of related to this, how big a role do you think there should be for universal entitlements? So, for example, to free school meals, to capture those who are not eligible under current means testing?
Well, I've not thought about that in free school meals, though there is some discussion about extending free school meals. But I think if you think about, universal basic incomes or something like that, I mean, we know they're very badly targeted at lifting people out of poverty. So again, I'd refer to work by my colleagues at the IFS, where that the amount of money we'd have to spend to have the same reduction in poverty for a universal income is enormous. It's completely unfeasible. So I don't think that's the way to go. I think that thinking about how it is true that take up of Healthy Start vouchers and free school meals is a problem. And so I think looking at the details of the designs of those policies and how we could extend them in ways that really target the most vulnerable is important to do. I think the details and the nitty-gritty aspects of the design.
Yeah. So there's a question about, so the questioner has raised a question that policies that are effective need to reduce the experience utility of those who are obese relative to those who are not. But the questioner says, well, that doesn't really seem to be widely accepted. And we also think that this is going to disproportionately affect the less well off. Again, do you think this conundrum can be solved in a non-paternalistic way?
So for me, the compelling group is young children living in poverty. And I don't think that those children, is it paternalistic for 2-year-olds? Yes, we should be paternalistic to 2-year-olds. I mean, that they're children. That's what parents do. And where the state should intervene is where parents are failing to do their job properly. Maybe not through their own fault, maybe because they had a bunch of bad shocks and they're in a state, they have mental health problems, they need help. I don't think this is about berating people to tell them what to do. I think there are demonstrably a group of children who are living in households where the household is struggling to provide the most essential needs for that child to grow up. We make children go to school. That we have lots of sense in which we protect children by requiring them to do certain things. I think requiring children to eat a nutritious meal is a completely reasonable thing to do. We would hope that parents would do that. Where parents are neither capable or willing for some reason, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that the state should intervene to do that. Honestly, I agree. I don't think the state has any business in whether I choose to pig out on biscuits or not. That's fine. Not that bothered. I mean, there are some marginal reasons to do with externalities and stuff, but for me, that's not the compelling reason here why we want to intervene. I think one could have an intelligent discussion about that. I don't see the intelligent discussion. I don't see why you could possibly object to ensuring that a 2-year-old child eats a diet that makes it sufficient that they can attend school and have some opportunity for a fulfilling life.
So that's a very broad question now. Do you think there's room to link policies to reduce obesity and policies to curb climate change? For example, cutting meat consumption? Or do you view them as opposing incentives that potentially increase the decision burden on poor individuals?
I don't think they're opposing, but I'm not sure that you want to try and have one policy instrument that tries to achieve multiple aims. So I would say that those are both policy aims that we probably want to achieve: reducing child obesity and reducing environmental damage of food. And so we should think about policies that achieve both of those. Do they need to be the same policy? I don't know. We need to think about the policy mix. I don't think they're really in conflict with each other, actually. But where they are, then we need to weight those up and figure out the best policy mix. But I don't see that as being particularly complicated.
Okay. So there's a question now which is about the other side, which is about calorie expenditure. Do you think that in these policies should be more connected to the education system and to sports and physical exercise?
Well, so that's an area that I would love to do more research on. So from my own personal point of view, I think exercise is incredibly important. My medical colleagues tell me, and there's actually some quite interesting work that's just been publicized in the media by scientists at Harvard, suggests that increasing exercise is very difficult to reduce obesity by increasing exercise because the body responds. So again, that's not my personal experience, but the medical people tell me that that's true. The other thing that I've heard them say is that it's very expensive. It's much more difficult to target, to get people more active. So getting kids more active in school is expensive. Schools, so we would need to come with big budgets. Schools are already under pressure to do a lot of things. There's been some pushback from schools saying, we want to deliver the maths curriculum. You now want us also to make kids do sports. That's a lot. I think that's a great question. It's not something I've done any research on. So I don't know. I think it's super important. I mean, I think it goes back to the question about mental health and family. People who are living good, happy lives are healthy in all sorts of dimensions. So we want policies that help people live good, happy lives, and having fulfilling job is certainly part of that. There's possibly other things, but those are complicated. How do we make society such that everyone's living a good, happy life? The Deaton Review is looking into those issues, but that's a very complicated, large set of policies.
Yeah, close to the set of policies around good jobs as well. That's another
Absolutely.
very complicated area.
Absolutely, good work is an important part of a good life, but also participation in society, in civic society, in all sorts of aspects of society.
And having the time to do that.
Yeah.
So there's a more technical question, which is, how do you ensure that the measure of poverty that you're using in the analysis is close to the reality? I'm not sure whether that means that from the question of whether it's close to the reality of whether it measures the income people have, or whether it's the experience of poverty that's measured by low income. So,
yeah. So actually, that's a great question. There's a lot behind that. There's a bit of a puzzle that I totally skipped over here, is that if you just look at how diet quality and obesity and lots of things vary with income, they actually don't vary that systematic. There's a bit of evidence that varies. The strong correlation is with deprivation of areas deprivation. And so it just goes back to what we were just talking about. I think income poverty is a very limited view of what poverty is. Poverty really is, I think, more importantly, particularly in this area, is much more poverty of experience, of opportunity. So income is certainly a very important part of that. But your ability to live in a good situation, in a good house, in a society where you have time to do what you want to do and socialize, etc., is probably more important. And so just empirically in the work we do, we've tended to use deprivation area or social class, both of which reflect more than income poverty. But there's been a lot of work done by the Social Statistics Commission, for example, looking at poverty measurement in the UK and others. So I think that's a great question and a great area for research.
And it links to the environmental issue that you raised about where people live. So there's an older literature, obviously, about things like food deserts, that the kind of shops that can serve poor individuals need to keep food with high shelf life, those and cheap, and those tend to be full of additives and don't perish, and therefore people's actual choices that they can make are more limited. Has any of your work shown that changed over time, Rachel, as the kind of supermarket and retail landscape has changed in Britain? Have you done any work on that? Do you know of work on that?
Well, there's a very good paper in the US that looks at the evidence for food deserts. So one point that the sort of more IO side of economics has made is that firms respond to supply. So if there's people in an area that want to buy healthy foods, firms will tend to supply it. And so the food desert argument is perhaps that. So what the paper in the US shows is that it's all driven by variation in demand preferences. That in more deprived areas, people don't buy healthy food, even if you put available, so firms don't provide it. So this is a bit which came first, the chicken or the egg. And of course, it could be that there's some people living in those areas that would like to buy fresh fruit, but there's just not enough people that want to buy it, so that the stores don't keep it. In the UK, we have a very densely populated country. And so most people in the UK, in fact, I used to know the exact number, something like 80% of people in the UK have at least 2 supermarkets within 2 kilometers of them, or something like that. So it's very few people in the UK that can't get to a large supermarket that's selling food relatively cheaply. So that doesn't mean to say that the food environment isn't important. I think it clearly is important, but whether that particular aspect of it is important is not clear.
We have 1 minute or so left, and I wanted you to reflect a little bit on a really striking picture that you showed initially, which was this variation within individual in consumption. And you kind of said it was a lack of self-control. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's actually something quite striking that I've not seen before.
No, I'm glad you picked up on that. That's in fact one of my most favorite just discoveries this last 2 years or something. No, so that hasn't been shown before because we don't have that much longitudinal data on what people buy. So it's very striking. And I think that really merits more investigation about, the fact that variation in diet quality within individuals is bigger, or at least as big as across individuals. And I think we know relatively little about that. So in that paper, we had a particular story that we were looking at about people's self-control problems. But I think understanding more about what's driving that variation is very important to think about to think about policy. So why is it that people have a good quality diet sometime and a poor quality diet some other time?
Yeah.
I think we know relatively little about that. We don't have that much data to look at it, but now we are starting to get that kind of data. You need longitudinal data on people's food.
I think that's super exciting as an agenda too. So on that note, we have come to the end of our time. I just want to thank you, Rachel, for an absolutely fabulous and stimulating talk. And I think that the pile of questions that came in just illustrated that the audience thought so too. So we can't thank you in the traditional way. I can clap, but I've got bad hands, so I'm not going to make much noise. So thank you again, Rachel. It was just fabulous and just showed your incredible ability to cut through and really make sense of things using economics. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Carol. Thank you everyone for listening.
Bye, everybody.